So I apologize, I didn't bring a cord for the computer, and there's only a PC hookup, so I don't have the slides to go with. If anybody wants to see photos afterwards, I'd be happy to share them. So what I was invited to talk about is, I work with the Syracuse Peace Council. Part of my work has been working on U.S. policy in Latin America. And Peter asked if we could address a little bit the U.S. war on drugs overseas and the foreign policy aspect of it. And some of the frameworks that Peter mentioned I think are actually pretty relevant. You know, he talked about the criminalization of the drug problem in the U.S. and how that has exacerbated our problem in some ways. What we've done with our foreign policy is not a criminalization, it's a militarization of the drug problem. And that's the framework I think we should look at this from. The country I have the most experience with is Colombia. I've been there 3 times in the last few years. I've done a lot of work with social organizations there. This is a country right at the top of South America geographically, border with Panama. It has coasts on both oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. Sometimes in the U.S. we tend to think of other countries as being very small. Just to give you a sense, Colombia is the size of Britain, France, and Germany put together. It's the 4th largest population in South America. It's not a tiny country, you know, but it's not huge. Think about it about 3 times the size of Montana, right? Okay, that just to give you a perspective on it. This is a country in a lot of ways of extremes, of contradictions, right? They have the Andes Mountains coming in north to south, but also the lowlands of the Caribbean. Highly concentrated populations in the urban areas, and the cities are like any European city. Massive skyscrapers, a heavily industrialized country in a lot of ways, very developed. We're not talking about, you know, going back in time when you travel to Colombia. It's a very advanced society. On the other hand, there are still, because of geography, because of the mountains and the way the country's divided up, there are still very isolated rural populations where you can go out and find people living without, for example, indoor plumbing. It's also an incredibly rich country, right? Colombia has about 1% of the U.S. territory, has 10% of the world's flora and fauna. Rich in resources, rich in diversity. The main sort of crops or products that they're producing are things, well, tell me, what do you know Colombia for? You can probably name some. Coffee.
Only coffee. Cocaine.
Cocaine. It's a serious percentage of the GDP, yes. Cut flowers, some people don't know that, but cut flowers. But also petroleum, coal mines, particularly in the north, oil more in the south along the borders with Ecuador, gold. A lot of really precious minerals and resources in Colombia. It's an important background context to have in mind. While the country is rich in resources, the people are not. Over 50% of the Colombian people live in poverty. We're talking about 20% unemployment. This is also a crucial background context to have because while in the U.S., the problem may be one of education and maybe a human experience we're looking at, that's not what the problem is overseas. It's an economic problem. We've provided a militarized solution to what is fundamentally an economic problem and a problem of social inequality. The other important context to have for Colombia is that because of this disparity, because of the situation of inequality in a country with so many resources, there has been, for the last 50 years, a raging internal conflict. The Colombian state has not fully had control of its own territory for the last 50 years. The major armed actors, which some of you may have heard about, are called the FARC, heavily concentrated in the south of the country. They, for all intents and purposes, are the state in some portions of the southern part of Colombia. There are a couple of other guerrilla groups, one in the north, and a large paramilitary contingent, which is sort of on the right wing. The guerrillas are on the left wing, the paramilitaries are on the right wing, and heavily connected to the military. Colombia has had the worst human rights violations record of any military in the Western Hemisphere. Some people argue that should go to the U.S. military. That's another debate. The sort of recognized human rights organizations who track it have looked at their record for decades. They've had the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere. That's another important background context when we talk about providing a military solution to a problem, and we look what their role has been in their own country. So that's some of the context we're looking at. The reason why this is important to us in the United States, Colombia is the third largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, right? Top is Israel. Second is Egypt. Those two have been at the top for a very long time. They're not going anywhere. So number 3 is a pretty important position to be holding. So Colombia is a huge focus of U.S. aid. We have poured billions and billions of dollars into Colombia under the guise of the war on drugs. That is the public face of our U.S. aid in Colombia. The form of that aid has been about 80% military. There's been a slight shift in the last couple of years, but predominantly military aid. And when I say aid, that's a tricky word, right? Technically that money is going to the Colombian government. A huge portion of that money actually comes right back into our own country, because military aid in a lot of ways means helicopters. It means intelligence. It means training. Colombia, as Peter mentioned at the beginning that he got interested in this topic from going to the School of the Americas protest at Fort Benning, Georgia. Colombia is the country with the largest number of soldiers being trained in the U.S. That's a form of aid. It doesn't mean that we're not like writing a check to the Colombian government that they then go and spend on whatever they want to. There are very specific things that money's going for. So the question is, what have those billions of dollars bought us? What has it done for us? Coca production from 2000 to 2007, right? If we look at, those are the years where we have statistics available for, coca production has increased by 27% in Colombia. I'm going to bet that Peter can tell us that nobody in the U.S. has any problem getting access to cocaine. Just as available as it ever was. And in the meantime, one of the other things that our policies there have contributed to is a massive displacement of the Colombian population. Colombia just surpassed the Sudan for the largest internally displaced population in the world. In a country of 45 million people, there are 4 million people inside the country who've been pushed out of their own homes, their own land. And one of the ironies of this is people in Colombia who are growing coca, as I said before, are doing so for economic reasons, right? In those areas isolated from the central cities, they're disconnected from markets. They don't have infrastructure, roads. They don't have access to basic services. Because of the violence that has been happening over resource disparity, people have often been pushed to the margins. And one of the things that you can grow really easily is coca. It grows like a weed. When we traveled through Putumayo in the south of Colombia, off the side of the main roads, there are coca plants growing up the hillsides. I mean, it's not like people are hiding it. It's not like when you're growing pot in the U.S. I think people have the sense that, like, if we go to Colombia and we're looking to eradicate coca, like it's hard for us to find. Any tourist, anybody traveling to Colombia, you drive down the road, it's there, it's right off the side of the road in certain regions, not everywhere, but in certain regions. And you can grow multiple crops a year. Our main strategies for eradicating coca have been aerial fumigation of glyphosate, which is about 7 times stronger than Ultra Roundup. So imagine the impacts of that in one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. The Putumayo region drains into the Amazon basin, right? And we're doing massive aerial chemical fumigations there. The second main strategy has been forced manual eradication. So take a military with the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere, supply them with guns and intelligence, and send them out into rural communities to force people to eradicate their coca, and imagine what the results of that are going to be in a society with an internal political conflict. And you can see how we're compounding the problems of the violence and the inequality that were already existing in Colombia. And what's the result? People get pushed further and further to the margins, and even those who weren't growing coca before find themselves in a position where they have few options, and growing coca starts to look like a really good one. So the question that we were asked by a number of people when I've been in Colombia, why would you continue to do this? Why would you continue to pursue this policy when you can see it's not working? And a lot of people there say, the other thing you see along the highways when you drive down the road in this area are oil pipelines. And the people there will tell you they want us off the land because somebody wants our oil. They want what's underneath the land. And so it's an incredibly, in some ways, an incredibly complicated situation, and in other ways, an incredibly simple situation, because it comes down to the same thing that Peter said. It's a war about money.